When this painting was first exhibited more than 200 years ago, art critics considered it one of the finest works ever created up to that time. It even won the award for Best Painting in 1810, and yet, it was also widely criticized. In it, we see a family facing imminent death. A man clings to a tree while desperately trying to hold on to his family. A corpse floats in the rising water, and a mysterious old man embraces the man while holding an orange-colored bag in one of his hands. Although the work is titled Scene of the Flood, rather than focusing on divine punishment, it seems to portray the desperate struggle of human beings in the face of catastrophe. The idea of man confronting the immense and almost terrifying force of nature was one of the central themes of Romantic thought. And precisely because of this, the painting sparked considerable debate when it was first publicly exhibited. The author of this work was Anne-Louis Girodet de Roussy-Triosson, a painter who showed remarkable talent for drawing from a very young age. At just 18, he became a student of Jacques-Louis David, who at the time was one of the most important figures of French neoclassicism and had gained great fame after presenting The Oath of the Hirashi at the Salon of 1785. For 4 years, Girodet trained within that neoclassical language. The Oath of the Hirashi perfectly embodies this style, filled with idealized figures, orderly compositions, rational balance, geometric forms, themes from antiquity, and a highly polished brushwork that is almost imperceptible. Thanks to his talent, Girodet was able to compete for the Prix de Rome, one of the highest honors for a young artist at the time, and he won it in 1789. But before leaving Paris, he visited the Salon, where he saw The Flood by the painter Jean-Baptiste Regnault. The subject fascinated him so much that he made a sketch before departing for Rome. From that moment on, he wanted to paint his own version, but with a completely personal approach. Finally, it was not until the Salon of 1806 that Anne-Louis Girodet presented his own work to the public, titled Scene of a Flood. The painting shows a group of people, likely a family, trying to escape the rising water. At the center of the scene, a man carries an elderly figure on his shoulders, someone who appears unable to walk. At the same time, with his right hand, he tries to help a woman who is holding a small child in her arms. The child, desperately clinging to the woman's hair, causes her to lose her balance. The entire weight of the group's survival rests on the man, who is also gripping a branch with his left hand, a branch that seems on the verge of breaking. Girodet captures a moment of extreme tension, where we do not know what will happen in the next second. This feeling is reinforced by a highly innovative composition. The scene is structured around a strong diagonal formed by the arms of the man and the woman. This line, shifted to the left, creates a powerful sense of instability. The effect is intensified by the fabrics, blown by the wind, which also move in that direction. That diagonal seems to point toward two possible outcomes. To the left, everything suggests a fall and death, hinted at by the figure of a woman floating in the water. To the right, however, there is a possible salvation, represented by a clearer patch of sky and the green tones emerging behind the tree. Yet Girodet does not give us a clear answer about the outcome of this story. Even before the Salon opened its doors on September 16, 1806, the work was already surrounded by a problem. The Academy, responsible for printing the official exhibition catalogue, made a mistake when registering the painting. Instead of appearing as Scene of a Flood, it was presented as Scene of the Deluge. At first glance, this may seem like a minor detail, but in reality, it was crucial. At that time, a work titled as a deluge would almost automatically be associated with the biblical flood, and that completely changed how the public would interpret the painting. There were several reasons for this confusion. On one hand, the Academy was used to artists treating this subject in a biblical context. On the other, paintings of the flood were usually done in a horizontal format to show a broad vision of the catastrophe. When a vertical format was chosen, it typically represented a fragment or episode, a small group of figures summarizing the tragic fate of humanity. This was precisely the case with the Universal Flood by Jean-Baptiste Regnault, the work Girodet had admired years earlier. Moreover, the enormous size of Girodet's canvas, measuring 4.32 by 3.41 meters, further reinforced that interpretation. Such a large format was usually reserved for grand history painting, meaning mythological, biblical, historical, or allegorical subjects. For this reason, Girodet reacted quickly and wrote a letter to clarify the misunderstanding. In it, he explained that he used the word flood not in a biblical sense, but as a sudden and localized natural disaster caused by violent forces of nature, like the recent tragedies that had occurred in Switzerland. With this clarification, the artist wanted to make it clear that his painting did not represent the biblical flood. It was not a religious work or a grand historical scene in the traditional sense. Rather, it was an image of human beings confronting a natural catastrophe, a contemporary and deeply human tragedy. The idea of human beings, threatened by the forces of nature, began to appear in art toward the end of the 18th century. One of the events that most influenced this shift was the Lisbon earthquake of 1755, a tragedy that deeply shocked all of Europe. From that moment on, modern man became more aware of his fragility in the face of natural phenomena such as earthquakes, floods, or storms. At the same time, the rise of science during the Enlightenment encouraged a new interest in studying and understanding these kinds of catastrophes. However, the letter in which Girodet clarified the true meaning of his painting was not published in Le Journal de Paris until 5 days after the salon had opened. By then, it was already too late. Several critics had written their first impressions as early as September 16th, the opening day, and many interpreted the work as a representation of the biblical flood. Misled by the Academy's error, some of them even complained about having to explain to the public that the scene depicted the biblical deluge, when in fact that interpretation was incorrect. In this way, the mistake in the catalogue not only altered the reading of the work, but also shaped how it was received from the very beginning. Girodet's interventions in the press attracted significant attention and were widely discussed. All of this ultimately generated enormous anticipation around the painting. The controversy sparked public curiosity, increased interest in the work, and turned it into one of the major highlights of the Salon. The critics who wrote about the work before Girodet's letter was published, or who simply did not read it, misinterpreted the scene. Believing it to be a representation of the biblical flood, they tried to find some form of guilt in the characters that would justify the divine punishment they were enduring. Some, for example, saw in the old man an image of greed, one of the 7 deadly sins, because he tightly holds a bag in his left hand. Others believed they detected selfishness in the scene, in the old man clinging to the younger man to save himself, or in the child desperately pulling the woman's hair. One critic even went so far as to claim that no compassion should be felt for them, because if God had chosen to punish them, then their suffering must have been deserved. Once Girodet's letter was finally made public and it became clear that the painting did not represent the biblical flood, this type of criticism began to fade. But that does not mean the controversy ended. On the contrary, all kinds of interpretations and objections began to multiply in the press. Some saw in the scene an allegory of the stages of human life: childhood, adulthood, and old age. Others thought it recalled the myth of Aeneas, carrying his father while fleeing the burning city of Troy. There were also those who interpreted the work as a representation of a conflict between two duties: the duty toward one's parents and the duty toward one's own wife and child. From that point on, the criticisms varied widely. For some, the colors were too light, for others, too dark. Some believed Girodet was capable of doing better. Others argued that the composition was too unbalanced. There were even those who claimed the artist had gone too far because the subject was excessively violent, unpleasant, and chaotic. In their view, a painting could move the viewer, yes, but not to the point of leaving them saddened or distressed. The credibility of the scene was also heavily questioned. Some critics found it unconvincing that the lightning would illuminate the figures in such a way. Others argued that the figures adopted overly forced poses, almost like acrobats. Doubts were raised both about the strength of the man carrying his family and the grip of the child pulling the woman's hair. Even the woman's body was criticized, with some claiming that her upper part appeared too soft compared to the firmness of the rest. Everything became a subject of reproach. The dead woman floating in the lower left corner was considered too beautiful and too serene for such a scene. Some said the water did not look muddy enough. Others questioned why the fabrics remained dry, or how such a small group had managed to reach that elevated position. With clear ill intent, one critic even wrote that a baby could not possibly be aware enough of danger to cry out in fear. In short, the work unleashed a flood of criticism, not only because of its subject, but also because of the intensity with which it was portrayed. And in the end, this reveals just how much Girodet was pushing painting into new territory, one that was more emotional, more unstable, and far more modern. But before continuing with the fascinating story of this painting, I'd like to remind you that if you would like to collect it and have it hanging on your wall, you can now purchase it from our website. In our catalogue, you will find more than 900 historical paintings, so you can choose your favorites and turn your home into your own personal museum. Shipping is free worldwide, and by purchasing from the store, you will be supporting me enormously in continuing to create videos like this every week. I'll leave the link in the description so you can place your order once you finish watching this video. Now then, let's continue. In 1810, the painting was exhibited once again, this time competing for the Prix Décennaux, an award created to recognize the best work of an entire decade. On that occasion, Girodet had to compete against none other than his former teacher, Jacques-Louis David, who presented one of the most representative works of neoclassicism, The Intervention of the Sabine Women. The competition generated enormous interest. After a long deliberation, the jury decided to award Girodet the prize for the best historical painting of the decade, while David received only an honorable mention. The Academy confirmed the decision and published a report explaining its reasoning. Although David's painting was praised, several issues were pointed out: a certain lack of originality, confusion between foreground and background, limited vitality, lack of harmony, and even some inaccuracies in the depiction of the human body. In contrast, Girodet's work was highly celebrated. The jury considered the subject entirely original and the composition bold. The criticisms that had appeared in 1806 were not ignored, but they were overshadowed by the enthusiasm generated by the painting's energy, sensitivity, emotional force, drama, dynamism, and the blend of grace and power it conveyed. The decision sparked intense debate. Many found it scandalous that the student had defeated his former master. Girodet's detractors repeated many of the objections they had already raised in 1806. However, others began to recognize more clearly the qualities of Scene of a Flood. What had once been seen as an unbalanced composition started to be interpreted as a bold and original approach, capable of breaking away from the traditional pyramidal structure. The nudity of the figures and the drapery were also appreciated, giving the scene a timeless character, along with the anatomical precision with which the bodies were rendered. When the work was exhibited again in 1814, the context had changed. Girodet still held an important place in the Salon, and alongside his new works, earlier paintings such as Scene of a Flood were also displayed. Many of the criticisms from 1806 and 1810 reappeared almost unchanged. Even so, the overall perception of the work continued to evolve. For some, it was no longer just a controversial painting, but a true monument in the history of French painting. The fact that the work was exhibited again every few years makes it possible to clearly see how the aesthetic ideas of the time were changing. Since the 1760s, neoclassicism had been the dominant and almost official artistic style. Its influence was so strong that it had imposed a particular way of understanding beauty, order, and painting. But public taste was beginning to shift. A new generation of artists, including Girodet, sought to move away from the rigid rules of neoclassicism. Romanticism had not yet been fully established as a recognized movement, but it was already emerging in the work of painters we now consider proto-romantic, such as Henry Fuseli and William Blake. In contrast to the geometric, balanced, and almost theatrical compositions of the previous generation, younger artists like Girodet, Fleury Richard, and Pierre Revoir began to use diagonal compositions, more unstable and tense, conveying a sense of imbalance. Instead of the rational ideal of neoclassicism, they emphasized passion, imagination, and disorder. And rather than focusing on grand biblical or mythological themes in a traditional sense, they became increasingly interested in human suffering caused not by divine punishment, but by the violence of nature. Thank you for watching the video until the end. I would love for you to share your thoughts about this painting in the comments. Thank you for your support, and I'll see you in the next video.